Assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. Happy New Year, my fellow assassins. Welcome to 2025. I'm honestly still surprised that it's 2025 already. I don't know about you, but I have no idea where 2024 went. And as I've mentioned in the past couple episodes, this is the third and final segment of the core modules series, I guess, that we're doing here. And the funny thing is this is actually the episode that started this entire series off. I think I touched on it a little bit in the first part of this series, but I was not planning on making this into 3 episodes. I was planning on just having this be one single standalone episode for the New Year's special, and then having a separate special for Christmas, and then doing kind of a standard episode for the week before Christmas. And then once I actually compiled all of the clips together, it ended up being about 3 hours, and I was like, it seems a little bit excessive for a single episode, and I don't know about you, but a 3-hour podcast isn't exactly the most palatable, unless I broke it up. Now, I guess if you're traveling somewhere and you're listening to this in the car or on the plane or something like that, then maybe 3 hours would actually have been preferential for you, but I'm sorry, I did not think of you when I split everything up. I was trying to keep it more to what our usual length is, which is kind of around the hour-ish segment or so, around that hour mark, which is kind of funny because initially, when the podcast first started, I was like, if I can get to around like 40 minutes for an episode, that would be pretty good. And then after being around like the 40-minute range for a while, then it kind of creeped up a little bit into the 50s, and then it just kind of jumped to being about an hour, give or take. Now, of course, we have some episodes that are like barely 50 minutes still, and then we have some that are like an hour and 20 plus. But generally, I like to try to keep it kind of within that hour window now. I think that's a fairly good digestible length for a podcast. Now, if you think I'm wrong with that and you want a different length, by all means, feel free to let me know. If you're on YouTube, you can leave a comment down below, or you can shoot me an email at at contact@darkassassins.com. There we go. Almost messed up my own email address, but the link's always down in the show notes below as well. But while you're kind of checking those things out, also make sure to subscribe to the podcast if you haven't done so already, and be sure to leave it a rating, review, and like it and all that good stuff, and share it around. And with that out of the way, let's get back into these core modules. And as I touched on at the end of last week's episode, we're getting into my VLAN story. And the reason why I wanted to put this in, as I kind of touched on last week, is it was kind of one of those moments that was always kind of a struggle for me when it came to home labbing. It was always that thing that I could never quite get, and I finally managed to get it, which is why I decided to include it, because it was such a big moment for me. So the VLAN episode, this is coming to us from the title called VLANs Are More Than Just Theory, from episode 76. I have talked about VLANs in the past on the podcast, and for me personally, VLANs has always been basically the bane of my existence when it comes to my home lab journey. So I've talked about other things that have been the bane of my existence, specifically graphics programming when it comes to software development. That's kind of been the bane of my existence there. And VLANs was basically the bane of my existence when it came to my home lab and just networking in general. Because every time that I tried to configure and set up VLANs, I always failed. and generally failed in spectacular fashion. Again, living up to my name of a code monkey who occasionally breaks stuff in his home lab. Yeah, whenever I would try something with VLANs, I would break something in my home lab. Generally, quite terribly. And the thing that was really frustrating about it was I understood the concepts and I understood the theory behind VLANs, why you use them, and how they work. So I basically had the academic education without the actual practical use case. So in other words, I basically had no idea what I was doing because I'd never actually done it before. So this is another instance where just because you have the academic smarts, that does not necessarily translate to real knowledge on how to actually do something. But then whenever I would try to actually implement it, it would always fail and blow up in my face, and in practice I could never get it to work and was really frustrating. Because if you kind of understand the concept of something, but you can't do the implementation aspect, at least to me, that's something that's really frustrating. Now, some people, they might not care as long as they understand how it works, that's fine, and they go on their merry way and be happy. But for me, I don't think... When talking about a technical concept like this, like VLANs or like programming, for me, in my opinion, you don't truly understand the concept or the topic unless you can implement it. Because you can talk all the shop you want, but when the rubber hits the road and something needs to be done, if you can't get it done, do you really know how to do it, or the whole idea behind it, right? That maybe that's just how I think, and maybe that's not how you think, but that's how I interpreted it. So for me, kind of talking about VLANs and this understanding that I had about them, in a way, kind of seemed fake or false in the sense that I understood the theory and the concept but never actually implemented them. I could talk the shop, but when time came for rubber to hit the road, I would be like a fish out of water. So with this new Brocade switch, I decided that I would give VLANs another crack. I would give them another shot. I don't know how many attempts I was up to at this point. It was probably at least I would say it was at least my third attempt, if not more. I tried on other switches before and it just never worked. But anyway, I figured I'd give it another shot. So I basically took the idea and the term of home lab to its actual core roots and using it to its fullest potential, emphasizing the lab aspect of it as a way to just play around with, test and experiment, break things, and just doing it all for the sake of learning, which in a nutshell is basically what a home lab is. I pretty much spent a solid 3 days, like I mentioned, once I got the PoE working on the Raspberry Pi, up until the recording of this podcast episode, I pretty much spent every waking hour of free time that I had working on VLANs and playing around with them and trying to figure them out, which here comes some irony. I spent a solid 3 days trying to get VLANs to work, trying to understand, the commands that go behind it, how to configure things, all that stuff. And while I was failing quite a bit at times, I was enjoying it. I was learning, and it was a fantastic experience documenting everything. It was pretty great. But at the same time, if I was, say, assigned a school project or a school assignment to do the exact same thing, I would be kicking and screaming the whole time and be hating every waking second of it, which is kind of the irony, because if I want to learn something and it's me giving the motivation and drive to do it, I am all for it and super happy to learn. But if it's something I'm kind of forced to do for like a school project or whatever, I'm just not interested in the subject. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic that I always find myself in. Maybe some of you are like that too. I don't know. But it's something that I always found, like if it's something that I really want to do, I'll be happy to spend hours and hours and days on end trying to learn it and figure it out. But if the roles were reversed and I was kind of forced to do it, I would have absolutely no interest. Even if it was something that I had the idea about, I would be more than happy to sink days of my own time in. But anyway, that kind of tangent aside, let's get into how things actually went. So the first night, basically, I failed spectacularly. It was pretty much more of the same of what I was used to with VLANs. Just nothing worked. Now, in fairness, I did create a heck of a lot of VLANs, quite a bit of them. Created a bunch of them, deleted a bunch of them, but that was pretty much it. I mean, on the Brocade switch and on like Cisco and other switches, creating VLANs is trivial. I mean, if you're using like a GUI interface, it's like click, click, and you're done. On the command line, it was literally specifically for the Brocade, and I think Cisco's syntax is similar, but not quite the same. It was like VLAN and the ID, so say VLAN 10, and then pick a port on the switch and assign it to the VLAN, and bada bing, bada boom, you created a VLAN. Congratulations. But just because you created a VLAN doesn't mean it's functional. So that's pretty much how far I got. So I kind of swung some punches, but at the end of the day, I got beat down pretty bad and kicked to the curb and got my butt handed to me by VLANs yet again. But then came the second night, which actually I guess I'll go back to creating the VLANs. So I was able to create them, but I had the main issues that I was running into was I couldn't get internet access on any of them, and there was no inter VLAN communication whatsoever going on. So basically that idea being if I created two VLANs, they were not able to talk to each other at all. And similarly, if it was on one of those VLANs, couldn't access the internet. So on the one hand, though, I guess if I was trying to set up a VLAN for IoT devices that try to reach out to who knows where and try to phone home and all that garbage, I guess I would have succeeded pretty darn well in making sure that they were isolated and not able to get out. But obviously not the desired outcome that I was looking for. So I was again pretty frustrated at that result, and I gave it up for the night. I cut my losses. I was not stubborn and stayed up till like 3 a.m. like I have done before on projects. I actually went to bed at a reasonable time. But then comes the second night, which the second night was actually pretty great. I had a mini breakthrough of sorts. Now, not everything was completely working, but I had got things to kind of start working. I mean, at this point, I had created so many VLANs that I could have probably created and configured a VLAN with my eyes closed because of how many I was doing. But the big thing that I was, I think, missing was the router aspect, because the switching aspect on the switch, creating the VLAN on there and setting up a router interface to be able to route in between VLANs was pretty easy. The issue kind of came with getting the broader internet access and then restricting access between VLANs and kind of the more nitty-gritty stuff. So I did kind of have a mini breakthrough. Things were kind of starting to work. And then day 3 happened. Day 3 was basically me starting out, going through the documentation I had written so far, which was kind of a hodgepodge of me just word vomiting into the home lab wiki that I have, and anything configuration wise that I had done, just so I wouldn't forget it. So basically, the beginning of day 3 was basically going through the steps that I had laid out and making sure I could replicate, the success that I had done on day 2. And things started out pretty well until somehow I managed to completely brick my pfSense instance. I don't exactly know what I did to brick it, because once I bricked it, I tried to revert back by undoing things that I did, but for whatever reason after that, I had absolutely no internet. DNS was completely unresponsive, and it just no internet whatsoever. And if you guys remember, a couple weeks back, I mentioned I had wrote a script to check in on my home network to see if my network was down. And I was getting notifications every 15 minutes for a solid few hours while I tried to troubleshoot this issue. Like clockwork, every 15 minutes, there's another notification. So that was a little aggravating. But thankfully, my backups saved my bacon yet again, because I restored from a backup. Because obviously, I didn't have the forethought and I wasn't smart enough to think, you know what, maybe I should take a snapshot of my pfSense instance right now, so in case I royally mess something up, I can just quickly roll back to a working instance. But obviously, I wasn't that smart and wasn't thinking that far ahead, so I had to use a backup that I had. The way that I finally managed to get VLANs and internet access working was to configure it in pfSense. So I had to make sure that I had each one of the VLANs, an instance of them configured inside of pfSense. So for example, if I wanted to create VLAN 10 on my switch, I would have to create VLAN 10 on my pfSense router. And then in that, I would have to give the VLAN 10 an interface, so I'd have to give an IP address within the IP address range that I set for that interface. So for example, if I created VLAN 10 with the IP address range of 10.10.10.0/24, for example, I would have to give the pfSense box an IP address within that range. Back to the trivia question, there is an X number of possible IP addresses that I could pick. Do you know which one it is? Little refresher there in case you forgot the trivia question. So I'd have to pick an IP address within that range. But there was some additional configuration that I had to work on and tweak, because while yes, pfSense is VLAN aware, and it could absolutely do all of the inner VLAN traffic routing for me, the problem is that would be a major bottleneck, because pfSense is running with a single gigabit connection to my switch, where the switch has way more switching and routing capacity built into it, in addition to having an specific hardware level processing to do all the routing and switching on the switch itself. I mean, that's literally what it's made for. So I could potentially see a decent amount of bottlenecking if I had a lot of inner VLAN traffic going on, because everything would have to congest down to that single 1 gigabit pipe. So I wanted to ensure that all of the inner VLAN routing traffic would happen on the switch itself. Now, by default, this is not a problem, but the issue is once you invoke pfSense into the mix, then you have to add a little more configuration. So basically what ended up fixing it for me was when I created the DHCP server for the VLAN on pfSense. So when I connect a a desktop computer into one of the ports that's on a certain VLAN, it'll actually get an IP address, which is kind of important, so I don't have to manually go setting IP addresses, which generally I mostly do for my servers anyway, just because I want static IP addresses. In other words, the IP addresses that never change. But for a device that I just want to plug in to connect, it would be nice to not have to do that. So I wanted DHCP. But the problem was, by default, that DHCP sets the pfSense router as the router. Now, this isn't an issue per se, but the problem is because it's set as the router, if I want to go to, say, a different VLAN, I have to go through the pfSense box in order to go back to the switch to the other VLAN. So not using the switch for the inner VLAN routing. So basically what I had to do was go into pfSense for the DHCP settings for that given interface and make sure the VLAN DHCP server, the gateway, was set to the IP of the switch on that VLAN rather than the IP of pfSense on that VLAN. And that inevitably fixed the issue. So that was basically kind of the main issue that I faced as far as inter VLAN routing. And then the other thing that I also had to figure out was, so this is kind of where I took a couple steps back, because on the second night when I kind of had my mini breakthrough, I didn't realize that initially. So all the routing was just going through pfSense, which in the one hand was nice, because pfSense could easily handle all of the inner VLAN blocking. So if I didn't want a specific VLAN access to any other VLAN, I could easily set that in the pfSense firewall rules. But since I was now doing all of the routing in between VLANs on the switch, that no longer worked anymore, because I could set all the firewall rules I wanted on pfSense, but since the traffic isn't getting to pfSense, it doesn't do anything. So I had to set up an access control list, or an ACL, for each one of the VLANs that I wanted to restrict the access to, because by default, any VLAN has access to any other VLAN. So if you want to, say, restrict a certain VLAN's access to other VLANs, or if you don't want to give it access to anything, you have to implement an access control list. Now, this can be kind of complicated, a little daunting, but if you're what familiar with like IP tables or configuring any kind of firewalls through like a command line, this probably would be pretty easy for you to figure out. I did find a guide online of someone that put together a pretty comprehensive ACL to really limit a VLAN's access. So I was able to kind of play around with that and experiment with it. And basically what I was able to get it to do was allow it access to the internet, but basically not access to any other VLAN, which that would be generally pretty ideal for, let's say, like a client VLAN, like if you wanted to have clients, or if you wanted basically people not to have access to all of your home lab goodies. You just wanted to give them access to the internet and be done with it. And then obviously if you wanted access to, if you didn't want to give them any access to anything, like say IoT devices, in addition to configuring the pfSense firewall, which I guess by default it would just deny everything, so you wouldn't really have to necessarily do anything on that front. But then you'd have to configure an ACL to basically deny access to all of the different VLANs. But you do have to be careful with that, though, because if you just do like a drop all, then it's not going to be able to get any kind of like DHCP, so it's not going to be able to get an IP address. And so you do have to do a little bit of configuring, but it's not super complicated once you kind of get the hang of it. So I know that was a very, very long clip, but I wanted to capture as much of the VLAN story as I could, while also making sure that you weren't losing too much context so you could kind of still track what was going on. Plus, the whole concept and idea of me kind of finally understanding VLANs was such a huge kind of milestone in my home lab journey, so I wanted to make sure that I captured as much of it as I could. This next clip, though, comes from when a server decided that it was just going to appear inside of my rack because there happened to be open space. And this comes from the episode Hacked by Proxy, Free Real Estate, if you see where that comes from, SFP Plus Shenanigans, Operation Core Dump, episode 77. I was just minding my own business, and suddenly, out of nowhere, a new server just appeared in my server rack. Now, I mentioned a few weeks ago that I decommissioned, in quotes, a couple servers and freed up some rack space. And I guess some random server on eBay saw that there was now free rack space and was like,
it's free real estate.
And then just appeared to occupy said space. Now, I'm not just going to let it sit there and do nothing, right? Like if a new server just appears in my rack, I mean, I'm going to put it to use because, I mean, if you come into my house and install yourself in my rack and do nothing, I mean, the audacity of you, server, I'm going to put you to work. Because unless your name, server, is Xserve, you don't get to just sit in my rack and look pretty, taking up precious rack space. Because seeing that I only have a 15U rack, which to some people be like, man, you can fill that much space. Yes. But that generally maybe not generally, but in the home labbing sphere, 15U is small in some cases, maybe middle of the road, but regardless, rack space is kind of at a premium these days. So if something is going to be in my rack, it better have a purpose and be doing something, unless I said it's an Xserve, because the Xserve pretty much just gets a free pass because, one, it just looks absolutely incredible. I mean, I wouldn't spend the money on it, but at the same time, I would not be opposed to having an entire rack filled with Xserves and Xserve raids, not doing anything, but just sitting there as just essentially like a museum piece, if you want to call it that. Now, I guess on the one hand, if you did have an entire server rack full of Xserves, I mean, the possibilities are endless, right? Like you could, I mean, you wouldn't need to buy a blow dryer. You wouldn't even need to blow dry your hair because you could just stand behind the back of your rack and just get absolutely blasted with a bunch of hot air. It'd be great for that. Also, I mentioned, come wintertime when things start to get cold. I mean, if you get cold, just walk behind the rack and you'll warm up. And if you want some rather loud but nonetheless white noise, I mean, what better solution than to have a rack full of Xserves, because these guys, they will be loud. Also, I guess if you don't want to hear anyone else talk or maybe even hear yourself think, that would be another excellent use for a full rack full of Xserves. But regardless, any other enterprise server that isn't named Xserve that is taking up rack space better be serving a purpose. So yeah, I put this thing to work. Now, as far as what server it was, I guess I didn't mention that. I decided, well, I guess since I'm trying to stick with this this tale here, this story of it just appearing in my rack and I didn't actually buy it. It is a Dell R730 XD, which basically the XD just referring to that the front is all drives rather than having any kind of like status information. But anyway, it's 12 large form factor drive bays in the front, or 12 3.5-inch bays on the front, and then it has two 2.5-inch bays on the rear. And basically, as you can probably guess right now, it is going to be replacing, well, I guess at this point, it has replaced my current NAS, or I guess now former NAS, which was the Dell R510. You know, if only that was actually how it would work and servers would just randomly appear in my server rack if I made free space for them, kind of like Santa Claus coming to leave presents under your Christmas tree type of a thing. But alas, I did have to purchase that server like all the other servers that I've ever owned. But this next story, it comes from a complaint that I had about my car when I got locked out of it because the battery died. Now, don't get it twisted. I love my car, and anyone that knows me knows that I very much love my car. But this was one thing that I had a little bit of a gripe about. And this comes from episode We Need More Analog, Apple Xserve Keeps Kicking, State Machines, Operation Core Dump from episode 79. Now, I don't think it's a secret that I am not a fan of certain types of software-based security, specifically when it comes to things like locks on doors, because as a software developer, I know things can be exploited, so I want hardware-based locks. And I think just in general, we need more analog-based things. Now, maybe that's just me being biased because, like I said, I'm a software developer and I know how software works. It can have bugs, and those bugs can cause things to break, and then things you rely on don't work, and that's no fun. And I had a rather interesting experience this week. It wasn't exactly a nerdy thing at all, really. But my car battery died this week, and nothing worked, which you're probably thinking, yeah, no dip, Sherlock, your battery died. What did you expect? And yes, you are correct. But when I say nothing worked, there's a couple things to take note of. Because my car is fancy schmancy, and I don't have to be a plebeian and actually use a key to turn the ignition, and it's all electric based. It's not an electric car, but like everything is powered electronically. There's no analog really involved. Things don't work. So if you have an older car where you actually have to, put the key in the ignition and turn it, if your car battery dies, there's a chance that maybe if you turn the key and try to, prime the ignition or whatever, you could maybe get enough juice into the battery to jump it, and maybe you'll be good. But when your car is literally a button that you press to start or stop it, if there's no juice, it car no go. So it won't work. But in addition to that, my car's doors are like a half frame type thing. So the best way that I can describe this without actually, showing a picture or anything, since obviously this is a podcast, is, those glasses that people sometimes wear where the frame only goes over the top of them and the bottom is just the glass of the glasses? That's basically what my car's doors are with the windows, except the framing part is the bottom. So that weather stripping part of the door that most cars have with the frame built in, that's just attached to the car. So what my car does is when you open the door, the window will shift down I don't know, maybe a couple centimeters or something like that, so the door can freely open, and then once you close it, it goes back up to where it's supposed to be to make that seal. But because that's all handled by the electronics, when the battery died, that didn't happen. So I was honestly kind of worried at times that I was going to like break the window because it wasn't, moving like it was supposed to. But anyway, that was only part of the issue because in addition to the windows and whatnot being electronic, another thing that was electronic is the trunk. So I was literally locked out of the trunk, which technically I wasn't, but I couldn't actually open the trunk from the outside. And even on the inside, there is a button to press to pop the trunk. But because that's also handled electronically, that didn't work either. So the funny thing was, the new car battery that I bought was, guess where? In the trunk. So I was locked out of the trunk, but the funny thing is I wasn't locked out of the car because the car's doors are electronic. So when the car battery died, the car was just perpetually unlocked, which is obviously not a good thing. If your locks are purely electronic and battery-based and your battery dies, locks don't work anymore. I mean, you're just asking for problems. So another reason why we need some real analog locks here, so, lock and key, works without any kind of electricity or power. So I kid you not, in order to get the replacement battery out of the car, to replace the battery that was dead, I had to get in the car, put the back seats down, and literally crawl through the car in order to get the battery out of the trunk because the trunk wouldn't open. So, yeah, we need more analog because it's like you can get in the car even though you potentially shouldn't be able to get into the car, but like the trunk's secure, of course, unless you get into the car and then put the seats down and, crawl through it, which I guess on the one hand, that was a nice fail-safe by the auto manufacturer that if your car battery did die and you had something important in the trunk, like, I don't know, maybe the new battery you were going to put in, you could actually still get to it. Now, obviously, you'd have to kind of work for it since you basically have to crawl through the car, but you could at least get to it. But the thing that really, I guess, concerned me overall else is the fact that the car was just unlocked. Right? Like I had locked it before, the battery died. So I made sure the car was locked. But then when the battery died, the car was just not locked anymore, which I guess you could argue on the one hand is nice since you wouldn't be locked out of the car, which if your car's locks are purely handled by the battery, that's honestly a good thing. So you don't get fully locked out of the car. So in that sense, like it makes sense that the car wouldn't, lock with the battery dead. But at the same time, it'd also be kind of nice that if for whatever reason I had to leave my car while I, go get a replacement battery or something, I wouldn't just be leaving it unattended, unlocked. It would be kind of nice as like a fail-safe to have some kind of physical lock for the car that you could actually, lock it and unlock it. But yeah, so I guess on the one hand, it's nice that they put that fail-safe in place, that if your car was locked when your battery died, you're still able to get into it. Because if they didn't put that in place and your battery died and there was no way to activate the lock anymore and you were just locked out of your car, that obviously wouldn't be a good solution either. So I guess they were kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, but as we kind of discussed, there's kind of a way that you could get around it. Needless to say, I think I'm going to keep a better eye out for the status of my car battery so this doesn't happen again. Now, this next clip had absolutely no context when I said it, and as such, I'm going to give it no context now. But if you know, you know. This episode came from Bluetooth Vulnerability, macOS on Linux. Don't Discount Programming Language, Operation Core Dump, episode 86. All of you out there across the U.S. and across the globe who heard Kool and the Gang's Celebration along with Andrew WK's Party Hard being blasted endlessly on repeat the entirety of this past week. No, I will not elaborate, and no, I will not apologize. So thank you very much for listening to this little public service announcement. Now, while that clip might not have made any sense to a lot of you, it made a lot of sense to me and still brings me great joy to hear, which is why I put it in here, since after all, this is my list of greatest hits, so that definitely has to make a space. Now, this next one is probably one that I would bet most of you actually haven't heard of, because this is one of the rare instances where I recorded part of the podcast after the outro music. So in case you're unaware, if you've never listened to the end of one of these podcasts before, I have outro music that plays at the end, but every now and again, I'll occasionally drop a little nugget at the very end as kind of like an epilogue, if you will, and this was one of those such instances. So this came from building out a home lab from budget to data center from episode 88. Now that I think of it, though, if I had a blank check, why don't I just get 2 40U racks, one full of Xserves, and one full of actual other computers? That's a good idea. Might go with that solution, too. I mean, it is a blank check after all. Now, of course, when I said 40U racks, I did, of course, mean 42U racks. But that's neither here nor there. This next one, though, has a lot of relevance, again, to us right now, mainly because we are now in the winter months and it is cold, and this comes to home labbings serving as space heaters. And this comes from the episode Productivity Tracking for Software Development, Justified or Unnecessary, from episode 91. A decent amount of the U.S., like the Midwest and Northeast, they've experienced quite a bit of a cold snap the past week or so, and I mean, us home labbers with our space heaters, I mean, we can just easily live life in luxury, basking in the heat that our home labs are pumping out while we enjoy watching the snowfall, while the normies out there without data centers in their house are, huddled in their blankets while their HVAC struggles to keep the heat running to keep the house warm. I kid, of course, but I'm also not going to sit here and deny the fact that if I close the door to my office, which is currently where my rack sits, it gets noticeably warmer, and to the point where if I then proceed to open the door, it's like a completely different climate inside versus outside of the room. Specifically, if this is in the summertime, it becomes basically unlivable in that room. It could easily get well over 80 degrees, and yeah, it gets pretty toasty in there. But I've also noticed too, like if I'm working on something within the rack, and I'm just kind of around it a lot, even if it's like cold in the house, like I'll still notice that like I'm kind of starting to sweat because I'm around all these servers pumping out a bunch of heat. And if I look at the management interface for some of my servers, like it's saying, the exhaust temp coming out of the back of these guys is like, 40 some degrees Celsius. I'm not exactly sure what that translates to Fahrenheit, but pretty darn warm. That's us with home servers and home labs are probably not doing too bad. I guess at least if you're sitting close to it, and maybe it's helping with your heating bill. Maybe letting the HVAC not have to work as hard. Maybe. Now, if you really want to live dangerously, what you could do is if you want to prevent potential pipe bursts like happened to me, you could just set up server racks right in front of all your exterior walls where pipes might be located and just heat the walls so you don't have to worry about it. Of course, the downside there is if a pipe does burst, your server rack is the first casualty, which would probably be very unfortunate and probably very costly to replace. So maybe don't do that. This next clip comes from earlier this year where there was a very funny and I'm hoping semi-sarcastic post on Reddit calling us software developers quote, smelly nerds. And this comes from our episode titled, What Does AI Think About Home Labs? From episode 96. I think I need to confess something, which is that I am a stupid, redacted, smelly nerd. And of course, I paraphrase that and use redacted rather than the actual word that was used because this is a family-friendly show, and the bomb, as it's known, starting with the sixth letter of the alphabet, is not exactly what I would call family-friendly. So, as a little bit of context, let me explain what I'm talking about. So, this all stems from some absolute fire memes that have been circulating around the developer community. It basically sums up to be Reddit drama. But the reason why I even bring this up in the first place is because it's actually kind of relevant because it actually deals with programming and software development in general, because normally like Reddit drama, like I don't even keep up with it. I don't care, don't know. But seeing that this was programming, I had to get to the bottom of it and figure out what was going on. So the drama originates from the GitHub subreddit where someone posted the following comment. And it is titled, I am new to GitHub and I have lots to say. And so that's the title. And this is what they say. I don't give a redacted about the redacted code. I just want to download the stupid redacted application and use it. Why is there code? Make a redacted exe file and give it to me. These dumb redacted think that everyone is a developer and understands code. Well, I'm not, and I don't understand it. I only know to download and install applications, so why the redacted is their code? Make an exe file and give it to me. Stupid, redacted, smelly nerds. Yeah, so a lot in there. A lot had to be redacted for the sake of this being a family-friendly program. But this individual was quite annoyed that there was no exe for them to download. Now, some people are alleging that this person that posted this post in the first place was essentially posting it for the sake of provoking a response. Like they knew that this would get people fired up and make some great responses out of it, and that's why they did it. Regardless, though, there have been some pretty fire memes on the subject. Pretty fantastic. So now we're going to switch gears a little bit and go from fire memes to fire performance. In this next clip, we're going to revisit the comparison we did between cache hits versus cache misses. And this comes from the episode Tech Buzzwords Decoded, 40x Performance with Cache, Writing MS-DOS Code, Operation Core Dump, episode 101. I decided to write a C++ program to optimize for cache hits to try to prove my point and gain a better understanding because, like I said at the top of the episode, I didn't feel like the explanation I gave about how cache performance can really improve the performance of your program. I didn't feel like I really drove that point home. So I decided to write this program. So, of course, like I said, the goal of it was to write the same exact code and be able to toggle between optimizing for cache hits and cache misses. So the way I went about doing this is changing how I accessed elements in the same array. So I created a 1000 by 1000 array that optimizes for cache hits by incrementing from 00 to 10 to 20, and then iterating for cache misses by going 00, 01, 02. So, of course, if you're going through that in a nested for loop, literally the only difference is you're swapping your X and Y or your I and your J or whatever your iterative elements are. So essentially all I was doing to simulate quote-unquote work was to force the compiler not to optimize it out, was to give the function a seed value, was what I called it, and then each iteration through the loop, it would basically take that seed value and add I think it was one of the iterator elements. I forget exactly which one I chose, but essentially I would run the application, run the program for 5 seconds, and essentially each time through the loop I would pass in like the current timestamp as the quote unquote seed, and then use that for the adding portion to actually simulate work, so the compiler couldn't just optimize it away. So that was the goal. And of course, since we wanted speed, I compiled with the OFAST flag to help ensure as much speed and performance as possible. Although the cache miss variant, that OFAST flag did absolutely nothing to the performance, and it did the exact same. Although the cache hit variant did significantly better with the OFAST flag compiler optimizations turned on. So let's get into these results. So the cache miss variant averaged around 710 passes in 5 seconds. And that's, of course, with both optimizations on and optimizations off. So turning on optimizations did absolutely nothing in this case for the cache misses. So for a little more context, that 710 passes roughly in 5 seconds equates to about 7 milliseconds per pass or so. Now, take a guess at the cache hit variant. So with no optimizations, absolutely none, with just doing the G++, no optimizations whatsoever, it completed roughly 2,170 passes in the same 5 seconds. So we're going from 710 to 2,170, which is roughly an average of 2 milliseconds per pass. So this is kind of what we talked about last week when we were talking about the cache performance. Like, if you actually think about it, if you only had one instance where you had a 4 to 5 millisecond delta with having a cache miss versus a cache hit, generally speaking, that's probably not going to make much of a difference. But again, like I mentioned, if you constantly have that miss over and over and over and over again, it can add up to be fairly significant. And as we can see here, that's roughly like a 205% increase in performance by optimizing for cache hits, and we literally didn't do anything else. Now, with that said, getting to the optimized version of optimizing for cache hits and using that OFAST flag, we got a whopping 27,000 passes in 5 seconds. And let me tell you something. When I was testing this, the variance in the number of passes in the optimized version was more than the cache miss version. So essentially the various small deltas I would see in the difference in performance of the optimized version, because again, you're not always going to get the exact same because other things are running on your system. So it's obvious that's why you run things multiple times to kind of get an average. But between the max and the minimum, it was more than the number of passes for the cache miss variant. So essentially, the optimized version was doing all of the miss version plus like an additional 27,000, which is absolutely insane. So for a per pass number, it was essentially doing this in 0.185 milliseconds per pass. So the cache hit variant with no optimization flags was about 2 milliseconds. The cache hit variant with the fast optimization flags was 0.185 milliseconds. So, and of course, on a per pass basis, that's not, on the surface, that doesn't look all that significant, right? Like if you only ran it once, to your eye, they would finish at the exact same time. They'd be basically instantaneous. But the thing is, when you have this going over and over and over again repetitively, that's where you really start to see the improvements in performance. And again, the only difference here in the code between the cache hit variant and the cache miss variant was how we indexed the array and the elements in the 2D array. That was literally it. Everything else was exactly the same. And so it just kind of goes to show you that a few clock cycles here and there can really add up over the course of a runtime of a program. The one thing I really like about that clip is it does a really good job of driving home the fact that operating system classes in school try to teach you, but don't do a good job of actually showing you how they work. Like when I took an operating system, like computer architecture type class in grad school, we talked about cache performance, but doing this experiment single-handedly gave me a better understanding of how cache performance actually works than that entire class ever did. So it just goes to show you how getting that hands-on experience really can kind of change your outlook and really help you better understand things. This next clip actually comes from the same episode as the one we just listened to, and this is when my home IP address checker actually kicked into high gear and worked rather than me just doing a test run. So that was kind of another big win for my home lab. So let's give that a listen. So basically, as a little bit of a background, this morning I woke up to another instance of notifications that my home lab was inaccessible because for whatever reason my internet was down. And the thing that was awesome about it, though, and the reason I'm bringing this up, is my IP address changed. So for the past, I don't know how long, I've had the same IP address, and it almost was like I had a static IP address because it was just unchanged for so long. And I had talked about a while ago on the podcast how I wrote a script to basically check to see if my IP address changed. And the only time that I saw that script actually work was when I forced it to think my IP address changed, and that was the only time I was able to actually see it work in the wild. But today, so I saw, I think it was 3 notifications saying my home lab was inaccessible, and then right after that, I see a notification saying my home IP address has changed to new IP address. And I was like, interesting. And then, of course, after I got that notification, no more unable to connect to the home lab notifications. So basically what happened was my internet went down, and then when it finally decided to come back up, I guess I lost the IP address I had, so my ISP issued me a new one, and then the script that I have to check my IP address noticed that change, updated it, sent the change to my VPS, or my virtual private server in the cloud, to allow me to check to see if my home network is accessible or not. And then the next time the VPS tried to connect to my home lab to perform this check to see if my network was up, that script, before it tries to connect to my home lab, it essentially it pulls the IP address that my other script, the one that pushes the IP address change, it pulls the IP address from that file that the IP address change checker pushes. So it basically pulled the new IP address, updated the VPN config, tried to connect to my home lab, was able to, and everything was all good. You know, that's honestly one of the best feelings I think that you can have as a home labber, is when you set up some kind of script or automation as kind of like a fail-safe or some kind of check or some kind of thing to make sure that stuff happens and keeps your home lab going, and to see it actually working in action rather than you just trying to make it work so you can get the satisfaction of seeing it work. Seeing it actually do it by itself is such an amazing feeling. So this next one is another one of these kind of random, off-the-wall, random thought moments I had on the podcast of going over iconic duos. And this comes from the episode Writing an HTTP Server, A Perfect Intro to Cybersecurity and Software Development, from episode 104. I was wondering, does software development and home labbing belong amongst the all-time greats when it comes to like the most iconic duos? And I before I even posed that question to you, I completely understand that this is a very elite, select number of duos. I mean, there's a ton of them out there, and they're pretty synonymous with one another. But I mean, if software development and home labbing is going to be even mentioned amongst these all-time greats, I mean, it'd be going up against some fierce competition, right? Like, just off the top of my head, I mean, you got Salt and Pepper. I mean, pretty iconic duo if you are a breakfast enjoyer. Jordan and Pippin, Bacon and Eggs, Biscuits and Gravy, the Jedi and committing war crimes during the Clone Wars, Peanut Butter and Jelly, Milk and Cookies, and I mean, we could probably do an entire podcast episode about iconic duos, but this is not one of those podcasts. The point of that little example list there was mainly just to kind of go over, some of the very iconic duos and what software development and home labbing would be going up against should it be inducted into this one of the all-time greats when it comes to iconic duos. Now, it's no secret that I desire to have a larger rack for my servers. But I'm not the only one that thinks that I need a larger rack, and I thought it was worth revisiting that conversation just to prove again to you all that it's not just me saying this, but others are saying it as well. And this comes from the episode Doing Things the Ansible Way, from episode 108. Let it be stated for the record here that I am not crazy and being unrealistic when I mention the fact that I need a bigger server rack in my house, because I had some company come over this past weekend and I was asked to show off my data center, and I was told by the people that asked to see my data center that I do indeed need a bigger rack. So of course I agreed with this sentiment because, I also think that I need a bigger one, but it just goes to show that someone besides me also thinks that I need a bigger rack. And the crazy thing about this is, when I first started my lab, I technically, I guess, started my lab, I think it was probably back in like 2018 before I even knew what home labbing was. But when I first actually got my rack, I started out with a 15U rack, and the funny thing is, when I first got it, it was completely barren and empty. I think I had like a small switch, a patch panel. I'm trying to remember when I first got it if I had so at one point I built my own custom 2U server, and I can't remember if that was right when I got the rack or a little bit after. But regardless, it was that and then a small shelf for my OG Dell Optiplex 7010. And when I first got, the rack and everything, I would look at it and see how empty it was and think, man, how am I ever gonna fill all this? And then, of course, whatever it ended up being 3-4 years later, however long it's been, now if I want to add something to the rack, I have to do all kinds of gymnastics and Tetris puzzles just to try to get things to fit and actually, slot into the rack, whether that's trying to rearrange servers around or trying to make room on a rack shelf, or it's a struggle. The 15U is very much filled at this point. So at some point there probably will need to be another rack, but I guess on the bright side, my wallet is probably happy because if I don't have any rack space to put servers, it kind of limits my ability to buy more servers because I don't really have any place to put said servers. But let's be honest here, that's probably not going to stop me because it wasn't all that long ago where I did have some empty space in my rack, and then shortly thereafter, a random R730 just magically appeared. Don't tell my wallet. But, things like that, if there is empty space, the space will be filled, is basically what I'm trying to say here. So potentially it could be a good thing, but also at the same time, it is nice to get and play with more hardware, even if that hardware isn't actually powered on. Because if we're being honest here, I would say close to, well, maybe not quite half, but like a decent percentage of the rack space that's occupied right now is actually unused, and some of it's even not even plugged in. Notably the Xserves, the Xserve and the Xserve Raid. They basically just sit there looking pretty because of course they are, but they're also massive power hogs. So yeah, but they are nice to look at. But even still, just having like servers in there just to play around with, whenever you feel like it is also quite nice. That point about, if there's open rack space, servers will just kind of show up and go into the empty rack space. It kind of reminds me of that saying where it doesn't matter how big a task is, it will fill the length of time you give it. So like if you give yourself like 3 weeks to complete, a project for school or something, it'll take you the 3 weeks. But if you're down to the wire and you only got like 2 days left, you'll get it done in 2 days. So kind of sort of like that, but switch it to like home labs and servers, and that's, I guess, kind of what we're talking about. This next clip comes from the episode Dr. Frankenstein's Back at It Again from episode 109, where DOS Dude 1 got his hands on some Apple DTKs, or Developer Transition Kits, and got them functional again. So here is that clip. Recently, I started work on getting my game to build on Apple Silicon with a DTK. And when you hear DTK, you're thinking, wait, Developer Transition Kit? But of course, when I say Apple Silicon, we're talking the M-series chips, and totally not an actual Apple Developer Transition Kit from Apple that developers had to apply for, pay, and then return to Apple back in 2020, which then Apple shipped all those devices off to be destroyed and had the logic boards drilled and cut to cause a short in the board layers to keep them from booting, only to then for me to somehow get a hold of one and then file down the cut to clear the short, resolder all the missing capacitors, resistors, pads, ripped off traces, or any other knocked off components, remove the underflow that was missing from the NAND chips, and replace them with new NANDs from an iPad Pro. But then, of course, you can't forget the step of reprogramming said NANDs in the first place with a NAND programmer, only to then transplant said board into a 2018 Mac Mini case with a power supply and an M1 Mac Mini I/O shield with antenna to fully restore said DTK into working order and using it. Now, obviously, that is a ton of work, so don't be silly. Now, I am not crazy to do something like that, but as you might have guessed from the topic of this episode, there is someone who is. And if you follow DOSDude1 at all on YouTube, you will most certainly have seen a video that he posted within the past week or two, maybe week and a half, on completely restoring a destroyed Apple developer transition kit to completely working order. And I, being a good friend of DOSDude1, was lucky enough to get my hands on one of the DTKs that he managed to repair, and I was very thankful for him for a few reasons. One, because the DTK is absolutely fantastic, as we will see shortly with some of the testing that I've done with it. And two, it is by far the rarest Mac that I have ever owned and probably will ever own, because up until this point, I would say the rarest Mac I've owned is probably the Xserve Raid, because I don't see a ton of those around. It's definitely between the Xserve Raid and the Xserve. I also do have a black MacBook, but I don't think those are necessarily as rare, although I don't know, maybe they are becoming more rare. Regardless, the DTK is hands down, it's not even a question anymore. Now, for the sake of time, I'm of course going to strip out the benchmark comparison of how fast the DTK was, but suffice it to say, it was not only the fastest Mac I had ever owned, but also drew the least power, especially when you compare it to the performance numbers it was putting out. Only recently was it topped when I got my hands on the new M4 Pro Mac Mini, and that thing has been fantastic. Now, it wouldn't be a best of the Dark Assassins podcast if we didn't include some of the Air Force One shenanigans, and what better shenanigans to include than from this past WWDC, and this episode was titled Air Force One-led Apple Strike Team launches a new form of intelligence, from episode 112. First off, can we just admire for a second how absolutely incredible that WWDC intro was? Now, if you did not have the privilege to watch the keynote live or watch the recording, I highly encourage you to, at the very least, watch the intro to it, because no explanation from me will be able to do justice to how absolutely insane and incredible it was. Because this intro started out with it looked like it was a spy movie, basically. So you have this like cargo looking, military-like almost plane, although not quite, but it is kind of, one of the styled off, I think it's the C-117, could be totally wrong on that, but it's like that military cargo plane that you'll see, and then like in like military movies you'll see like special operations troops jumping out of it. It basically kind of sort of resembled that. Anyway, so they're flying, and then Craig Federighi, aka Air Force One, is rallying the troops, making sure everybody's ready to go for WWDC. And then he makes a nod asking Phil Schiller, who happened to be piloting the plane, if he was good to go. And Phil was like, I'm getting too old for this. And then on an old school iPod with like the click wheel and everything, a white one, he starts playing Kickstart My Heart by Motley Crue. Absolutely incredible. And then, the all the various Apple employees are in like they're putting on their jumpsuits to hop out of the plane and like skydive into Apple Park and WWDC. And then right as they all jump out, Craig Federighi, I kid you not, puts his helmet on, and his helmet is in the shape of his hair. So while everyone else just has, a standard helmet on, he has a helmet shaped like his hair. I mean, I don't know how it can get any more awesome and cool than that. I don't know what we did to deserve Craig Federighi, but we better be counting our blessings, because that is just incredible. He keeps topping himself every year, it seems. So yeah, it almost kind of looked like it was some kind of special operations type scene. Hence the first part of the title of this week's episode. So. But in true legend Craig Federighi fashion, because you thought we were done with just the intro, but oh no, because he again turned it up to 11, because right before he switched to talk about macOS, he did some like crazy parkour, like down like some stairs and like all around. It was something to see. Like, so that would, I guess, be your second thing that you should watch if you didn't actually watch the keynote, is Craig Federighi doing some parkour. So while Apple might have wanted the takeaway from their WWDC keynote in 2024 to be Apple Intelligence, our true takeaway was just how incredible Craig Federighi is, aka Air Force One. Now, this next clip is one that I liked just from the perspective of it kind of came out of the blue, and this is from when I had some guy reach out to me about using the Xserve RAID Docker container that I created. So this comes from the episode Think of the Children, Windows Wi-Fi Vulnerability, Tranquility of Code, from Operation Core Dump, episode 113. Apparently, people are actually using my stuff. And what I mean by that is I got a message this week from a guy, I believe it was through LinkedIn that he reached out to me. And he was telling me that he was trying to run my Apple RAID admin Docker container for the Xserve RAID, and it wasn't working. So first off, I was completely confused, because I was like, wait, someone's actually asking a question about a piece of software I wrote that they're actually trying to use it? What? I think it probably was a first, that I've actually had someone reach out. But anyway, getting back to the point here. So essentially what happened was he was trying to run the Docker container that I made, and he was running it through the Docker Compose, of course, like I mentioned to do in the README. But for whatever reason, it wasn't working. So, but initially I was a little skeptical, because he was like, I tried to use it and it didn't work. And I was like, okay, can you give me a little more than that? Like, maybe some logs, or what specifically about it isn't working? Because I'm like, personally, when I hear someone saying, like, specifically in this case with the RAID admin thing, they say it doesn't work. I'm like, okay, so is the Docker Compose failing? Are you not able to log into it? Do you have the password wrong? Like, there's a lot of stuff I'm thinking about here. So I was like, can you give me a little more to work with here? So he ended up sending me his log file, and I took a look at it, and turned out to be quite a simple issue. So basically what had happened was he was using a MacBook Air. He was using an Apple Silicon-based MacBook Air, which of course is ARM-based. And the Java package that has to be installed for the RAID admin utility to work, it only exists for x86. So in essence, he was trying to install an x86 package on an ARM system, which was causing the error. But regardless, it was still really cool to see someone trying to make use of a tool I made. And of course, once I discovered this, I let him know. I was like, hey, so it looks like you're trying to run this on an Apple Silicon machine, which is ARM, and the package that's trying to be pulled is x86, so they're not compatible. So maybe if you try to use an x86 machine, you'd probably have better luck. So, basically give that a try. And he said he'd give it a shot. And I said, cool, if you have any other issues, let me know. I haven't heard anything back, so I'm assuming everything's working for him. But yeah, anyway, I just thought it was kind of cool, basically providing some tech support for this guy. And honestly, I was just happy to see that someone besides me was making use of this tool, because I know it was something that I was kind of looking for when I first started getting into the Xserve RAID. And of course, it didn't exist, at least not that I could find. So I decided to make it. So it's cool that someone else is making use of the tool. So the main reason I kind of put that clip in there was, something that I was passionate about making, this Docker container for Xserve RAID to make my life easier, and someone else that I've never heard of before, never knew this guy, don't know who he is, also found value in it, and I just thought that was really cool. Now, these next two clips come from two separate episodes, but talk about the same thing. So do you guys remember when CrowdStrike blew up the internet this past summer? So that's where these next two clips come from. The first of which comes from Do Code Reviews Improve Quality from episode 117, and the second clip comes from Beyond iOS with Swift from episode 118. Now, I want to roll right on into this week's cybersecurity tip. Hold that thought past me. Hi there, Dark Assassin from the future here. And before we get into this week's cybersecurity tip, I just need to interject for a quick second, because after I recorded this episode, CrowdStrike thought it would be a great idea to essentially blow up the internet. So I had to come in here after the fact and re-record this portion of the episode, or rather interject this portion of the episode. So of course, CrowdStrike didn't actually blow up the internet, but they metaphorically did with all of the computers that were rendered bricks and displaying that lovely Windows blue screen of death. So I wanted to have us put on our tinfoil hats for a second, because I have a conspiracy theory for you that I completely made up in all good fun, and by no means necessarily think this is true, but I just happen to come up with it because I like to do things like this sometimes. So we all know about the whole CrowdStrike fiasco that happened last week. And my tinfoil hat conspiracy that I have absolutely no evidence for whatsoever, aside from making a semi-logical argument that probably has a bunch of holes in it if you actually tried to fill it with water. But what if this whole CrowdStrike fiasco was just to garner more market share? And again, this is one of just those wild conspiracies that I come up with just for fun. But here is the basic premise of it, right? So your average Joe, and I'm assuming the vast majority of people before this whole CrowdStrike fiasco happened, had never heard of CrowdStrike before last week. And now it's practically a household name. So what if this was just a whole PR stunt in order to garner, more attention to it in order to gain more market share? Because after all, there's a saying out there, right, that all news is good news or something like that, or like all press is good press, basically free publicity, if you will, regardless of if it's positive or negative, just getting your name out there as kind of like free advertising. And boy, have they gotten a lot of free advertising, because so many people have been talking about this. With, of course, when you have all of those various devices around the world that basically halt the entire globe in some cases, kind of gets to be a big deal, and a lot of people are talking about it. So perhaps, with more people realizing what this company is, perhaps maybe they're looking into them and potentially thinking of buying their service. Although I guess on the other hand, it could go the opposite way too, that they see this massive issue with this company and now they're going to be like, I'm going to steer clear of them forever. So maybe there's two sides of it. Maybe this is all just a big old nothing burger. It probably is, because like I said, this is something I just completely made up for fun. Now, speaking of CrowdStrike, I am no financial expert by any means, so do not take this as financial advice. Plus, it's also in the past, so it doesn't really matter. But needless to say, if you happen to buy CrowdStrike stock shortly after this massive fiasco happened, you'd be sitting pretty darn good right now, since their stock did rebound basically back to pre-internet explosion levels. I don't think they're quite back there, but they're pretty darn close. So if you did happen to buy in like right at the bottom, you'd be sitting pretty good. So just thought I'd throw that out there. But the last one that I wanted to cover for this kind of greatest hits, if you will, is a page on GitHub that basically roasts GitHub profiles, and I decided to see what its roast would be for me. So what better way to cap off this greatest hits than a roast of yours truly? And this comes from the episode Fixing C Memory Errors with AI, oh boy, from episode 120. I did want to point out that your boy got absolutely flamed and roasted this week. Specifically, there is a site that I discovered called githubroast.pages.dev. Hilarious. And essentially how the site works is it uses I'm not sure what, LLM they used or whatnot, but essentially the point of this page is you give it any username for any user on GitHub, and they will essentially roast that user. So naturally, I had to see what it had cooking for me, and this is what it came up with. Oh, Dark Assassin 23, what a name you've chosen. Did you think it'd make you sound mysterious or edgy, or just plain painfully generic? With a whopping 6 followers, you might want to reevaluate what it means to be an elite, or what it means to be an elite in the GitHub world. Your repos are about as popular as a diet soda at a barbecue, 0 stargazers on most of them, and the few that have some don't quite scream success either. Elite encryption algorithm? More like minimal interest algorithm, and who knew a war simulator was the pinnacle of your ambition? Spoiler alert, it's not even a top-tier card game. With 37 public repos, it's shocking how you still manage to leave 0 impact. So many projects and yet so little attention. It's like you're a ghost hunting the code world, but instead of scaring people, you just confuse them. If you're trying to hide from the spotlight, mission accomplished, amigo. Now, I don't want to brag or anything, but that roast is a little outdated because I don't have 6 GitHub followers anymore. I have 7. So you know what? You can suck. That was weird. I guess we had a little bit of technical difficulties there at the end of that last me butting in to respond to the clip. But that is, in fact, the last clip that I had for you guys. I hope you enjoyed kind of this selection of some of my favorite moments, both moments that I thought were funny, insightful, impactful, or just kind of overall good in my opinion. But I'd be interested to hear your guys' thoughts on if I missed anything, or what your favorite segment was, what your favorite clip was. So definitely be sure to let me know either in the comments below if you're on YouTube, or you can shoot me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. And as I said in the beginning of this episode, make sure to leave this show a rating and review and subscribe if you haven't done so already, and be sure to share it around, because I think these past 3 episodes are kind of a really good selection of if someone has never heard of the Dark Assassins podcast before, kind of giving them an idea of what it's all about. We do talk about some serious stuff. We get into home labbing, we get into software development, and sometimes we just have fun and talk about random things that have nothing to do with any of that, but are funny. At least I think they're funny. So yeah. Just as a reminder again, we are back to our regularly scheduled programming next week with our trivia question, cybersecurity tip, nerdy things, and regular type of show. So that is coming up next week. But that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, bull nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.